The motel room smelled like mildew and resignation. Calla Frost sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at her phone screen as the voicemail replayed for the third time. Her grandfather's lawyer, calm and clinical, delivering news that felt both impossible and inevitable. Garrett Whitmore, age 78, died Thursday evening. Heart attack. Alone in his barn workshop, tools still in hand. The funeral would be Saturday in Ashwood Hollow, Montana, a place Calla hadn't seen in 22 years. Across the cramped room, Wren lay curled on the other bed, backpack serving as her pillow-stuffed rabbit clutched tight. 8 years old and already learning to sleep through uncertainty. 3 months in this roadside motel ever since the divorce papers finalized and Trevor stopped pretending he'd pay child support. 2 months since the dealership in Denver laid off half the mechanics, Calla included. Her toolbox, the good Snap-on set Garrett had gifted her 16th birthday, pawned for first and last month's rent that never materialized into an actual apartment. The phone buzzed again. Different lawyer this time. Estate matters. Calla answered, keeping her voice low. The man on the line spoke without preamble. Garrett Whitmore's will contained specific provisions. The homestead barn and 12 acres in Ashwood Hollow passed to Calla Frost, sole surviving grandchild, subject to occupancy requirement. 90 consecutive days of residence on the property beginning within 2 weeks of probate, or the inheritance would forfeit to the secondary beneficiary. Calla's throat tightened. 90 days. She glanced at Wren at the duffel bag stacked against the wall containing everything they owned. Montana meant leaving Denver, leaving the job search, leaving the last threads of a life that had already unraveled beyond recognition. But it also meant a roof, land, something solid beneath their feet for the first time since Trevor's fists taught her that love could curdle into violence. She asked about the secondary beneficiary, Vivian Whitmore, Garrett's niece, daughter of his late brother. The lawyer's tone suggested he expected conflict. Calla remembered Vivian dimly. A woman 10 years older, always immaculate, always disappointed. They'd overlapped at exactly 2 family gatherings before Calla's parents moved to Denver when she was 10. Vivian had been the kind of person who straightened picture frames in other people's homes and commented on dust. The lawyer continued. The will specified one additional detail. Inside the barn sat an asset of significant personal value. Garrett's exact words notarized. No further description provided. Calla ended the call and sat in the dark, listening to Wren's steady breathing. Significant personal value. Her grandfather had been a mechanic, brilliant with engines but indifferent to wealth. He'd lived alone in that barn for 50 years after Calla's grandmother died, fixing farm equipment and avoiding the world. What could he possibly consider valuable enough to name in a will? The funeral drew 17 people. Ashwood Hollow had shrunk since Calla's childhood, the kind of Montana town where logging died and tourism never quite arrived. The service lasted 20 minutes. The preacher, reading from notes, clearly hadn't known Garrett well. He spoke about service and solitude, about a man who kept to himself but fixed things when asked. Accurate enough. Bloodless. Vivian attended in black Chanel, her husband Preston at her side like expensive furniture. She approached Calla after the burial heels sinking into cemetery grass. Her voice carried the practiced sympathy of someone who'd never meant a condolence in her life. So sorry for your loss. Garrett was a unique man. Then, pivoting without pause, she mentioned the will. The 90-day requirement seemed excessive. Surely Calla had obligations in Denver. Perhaps they could discuss a more practical arrangement. Calla kept her hands in her coat pockets away from fists. She asked what Vivian had in mind. Preston stepped forward, extending a business card. Hale Development Corporation. He outlined the situation with the ease of a man who bought and sold land the way other people traded baseball cards. The entire ridge, Garrett's 12 acres included, had been identified for resort expansion. Ski slopes, luxury lodges, the economic revitalization Ashwood Hollow desperately needed. The land Calla just inherited sat at a critical juncture. Without it, the project couldn't proceed. With it, everyone benefited. Vivian's smile didn't reach her eyes. We're prepared to offer $100,000. Cash settlement, no contingencies. You take the money, we handle the property, everyone moves forward. Wren tugged Calla's sleeve, confused by the tension she could feel but not yet name. Calla looked past Preston, past Vivian, to the fresh grave where her grandfather's casket rested. Garrett had chosen to leave the land to her, not to his niece. Had built in requirements that forced her to stay to commit. He'd known she was struggling. Somehow across 600 miles of silence he'd known. She met Vivian's gaze and said no. The land wasn't for sale. Preston's expression cooled. He suggested she reconsider. Development projects of this scale involved complex legal instruments, eminent domain public good assessments. It would be unfortunate if things became adversarial. Calla picked up Wren and walked away. Behind her she heard Vivian's voice, sharp with something that sounded less like disappointment and more like rage. The drive from the cemetery to the barn took 11 minutes. Calla followed directions her phone provided, turning onto a gravel road that disappeared into pine forest. The GPS signal flickered and died. She continued on memory, on the ghost of being 10 years old in her parents' back seat, on the certainty that some places lived in your bones whether you wanted them to or not. The barn appeared through the trees like a shipwreck. 2 stories, weathered gray wood tin roof, oxidized to rust red. Behind it the land rose into foothills dense with lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. No neighbors visible, no power lines, just wilderness and silence. Calla parked and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. Wren pressed her face to the window, breath fogging the glass. "Is this where Grandpa Great lived?" Her voice small, awed. Calla nodded. The last time she'd been here, Garrett had taught her to gap spark plugs, to read compression, to understand that engines were just puzzles that rewarded patience. He'd smelled like motor oil, and coffee had moved with the unhurried precision of someone who knew exactly what his hands could do. She'd cried when her parents announced the move to Denver. Garrett had knelt eye level and told her something she'd never forgotten. "Good mechanics are everywhere, Calla, but good people who care about the work, who care about doing it right, those are rare. Don't let distance make you common." She'd been 10. She hadn't understood. Now, standing in the driveway of his life's last refuge, she thought maybe she did. The barn door hung crooked on iron hinges. Calla pushed it open, dust motes swirling in the afternoon light that slanted through gaps in the walls. The interior stretched vast and cluttered. Workbenches lined the perimeter, covered in tools organized with obsessive care. Hand planes arranged by size. Socket sets in perfect gradation. A drill press in the corner, a welder draped with a canvas tarp, shelving units filled with coffee cans sorted by the bolts and screws inside. And in the center, dominating the space like a cathedral's altar, something massive hidden beneath a gray tarp. Wren ran forward before Calla could stop her. Small hands grabbed the tarp's edge and pulled. The fabric slid away in a cascade of dust and revealed what lay beneath. A helicopter. Vintage, skeletal, in places beautiful despite its decay. The fuselage bore the bones of a Bell 47 frame, but modified, expanded. Dual rotors where a standard model would have one. Landing skids corroded but intact. The cockpit canopy missing, exposing the pilot's seat and instrument panel, both covered in grime but fundamentally whole. Calla approached slowly, heart hammering. Wren danced around the aircraft, delighted by its strangeness. "Mama, Grandpa Great had a helicopter. Can it fly? Can we fly it?" Calla ran her hand along the fuselage. The metal felt cold, dead. She peered into the engine compartment and saw complexity that went beyond anything she'd worked on. This wasn't a restoration project. This was an obsession, decades in the making, frozen at some moment of abandonment. Why had Garrett never mentioned this? In all the summers of her childhood, all the phone calls before her own life fell apart, and the distance between them grew into silence. He'd never said a word. Behind the helicopter, partially hidden by the landing skids, Wren discovered a door. Narrow, set flush with the barn's back wall. A chain looped through the handle, secured with a padlock that had oxidized green. Calla examined it. Industrial strength, ancient. No key visible anywhere on the workbenches. She tugged experimentally. The chain held firm. Wren climbed into the helicopter's cockpit, settling into the pilot's seat with the unself-conscious joy of a child who hadn't yet learned to fear disappointment. She grabbed the collective stick, made engine noises, declared herself a pilot. Calla smiled despite everything. Then Wren's voice changed, excited discovery replacing play. "Mama, there's something here." She held up an envelope, yellowed and water-stained. It had been taped to the underside of the pilot's seat, barely visible unless you were small enough and low enough to notice. Calla took it carefully, feeling the weight of paper inside the bulk of something metallic. Her name written in Garrett's angular handwriting across the front. Her hands trembled as she opened it. A small brass key fell into her palm. Behind it, a single sheet of paper folded once. She unfolded it and read words her grandfather had written probably years ago, certainly before he knew he'd die alone with a heart that finally gave up. "Calla, if you're reading this, I'm gone. The key opens my truth. I should have told you while living, but courage and I were never well acquainted. Build her, fly her, finish what I started for the woman I loved. The coordinates will show you where. I'm sorry I wasn't braver. I'm not sorry I loved. Grandpa Garrett." Below the message, written in different ink, added later a set of numbers. 47.2 degrees north, 113.8 degrees west. Calla stared at the words until they blurred. The woman I loved. Not her grandmother. Someone else. Someone who'd inspired this mechanical monument, this unfinished promise suspended in time. She looked at the chain door. The key fit the padlock perfectly. The lock opened with a snap that echoed through the barn. The chain fell away. Calla pulled the door open and stepped into a space that smelled of age and secrets kept too long. The workshop was small, maybe 10 feet square. A single window glass, thick with grime, provided minimal light. But even in the dimness, Calla could see the walls were covered. Photographs, dozens of them, pinned directly to the wood. Blueprints, technical drawings, schematics, spread across a desk that filled half the room. And above the desk, a portrait, black and white, carefully framed. A woman, young, maybe 25, laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. Dark hair swept back, eyes bright with intelligence and mischief. Beautiful in a way that transcended the photograph's age, that spoke to something fundamental about joy. Calla moved closer. On the desk, centered precisely, sat a leather journal. She opened it to the first page. Property of Garrett Whitmore, 1952. The entries began after his return from the war. Europe. B-17 bomber cruise. He wrote sparingly about combat, more extensively about coming home to Montana with skills nobody needed and memories nobody wanted. Then, 3 months into the journal, a new entry that changed tone completely. Met a woman today, Sloan Ashford. She teaches 3rd grade. I was fixing the school's boiler and she brought me coffee. We talked for 2 hours. I forgot I was covered in grease. She didn't seem to notice. I think I'm in trouble. Calla turned pages, watching her grandfather fall in love. The entries grew longer, more vulnerable. Sloan and I walked to the lake. She knows the names of birds I've never noticed. Sloan laughed at my joke about carburetors. Turns out she actually understood it. Sloan said yes. We're engaged. I can't believe someone that smart would choose me. Then abruptly the tone shattered. Her father found out. Banker. Old money. Doesn't approve of mechanics, especially broke ones fresh from war. Sloan tried to tell him we love each other. He threatened to disown her. She's scared. Subsequent entries documented Garrett's desperate attempt to prove himself worthy. He'd learned aircraft design in the Army Air Corps, had worked on experimental landing gear. He started sketching a helicopter, something innovative enough to attract attention, contracts, money. Something that would make him respectable in the eyes of a man who measured worth in dollars. The entries detailed endless hours of work. Parts, scrounged designs, refined a prototype taking shape. He called it Windbound after the way Sloan made him feel, grounded but yearning to fly. Calla flipped forward, searching for resolution. Instead, she found devastation. June 14th, 1954. She married Harold Kincaid today. I found out from the newspaper. Society page. The wedding I wasn't invited to. The life I wasn't good enough for. I don't know what to do with all this love that has nowhere to go. The next entry, 3 weeks later. Started drinking. Stopped working on Windbound. What's the point? Then, nothing for 6 months. When the writing resumed, the handwriting had changed, grown steadier, colder. I can't finish Windbound. Every time I look at her, I see Sloane, but I can't destroy her either. Maybe someday someone will. Someone braver than me. Someone who believes in promises kept even when the person you made them to is gone. Calla turned more pages, but the journal ended there. 1954. 70 years ago. Her grandfather had carried this grief for 7 decades, had lived in this barn with a monument to his failure, had never married again after Calla's grandmother died, because she realized now he'd already given his heart away to a woman who married someone else. She looked at the photographs on the walls, Garrett Young standing beside the helicopter in various stages of construction. Garrett and Sloane together, stolen moments captured by someone's camera. Their hands touching across a diner table. Sloane leaning against the helicopter's frame, laughing at something Garrett must have said. On the desk beneath the journal, Calla found a wooden box, hand-carved, locked. She tried the brass key from the envelope. It fit. Inside, stacked carefully, letters. Envelopes addressed to Garrett Whitmore in handwriting that matched the signature on the return address. Sloane Ashford. Calla pulled one out. The envelope had been stamped with a red rectangle, "Return to sender, refused." She checked another. Same stamp. A third. All of them, maybe 40 letters, all returned unopened. Her hands shook as she opened one, breaking the seal Garrett had apparently never broken himself. The letter inside was dated September 1953. My dearest Garrett, I've written you 17 times. You haven't responded. I don't know if you're angry or hurt, or simply done with me. My father says terrible things about you, calls you unworthy, says you never loved me. But I know better. I know what we had. Please write back. Please tell me you still want this. I'm strong enough to leave everything for you, but I'm not strong enough to leave without knowing you'll be there. I love you. I need to hear you love me too. Sloane. Calla sat down hard on the workshop's single chair. The letters weren't refused. Garrett had never seen them. Someone had intercepted them, stamped them, returned. Kept Sloane's words from ever reaching the man who would have crossed any distance to hear them. She thought of the journal entries. Garrett believing Sloane had abandoned him. Sloane, based on these letters, believing Garrett had rejected her. 2 people destroyed by someone else's cruelty, by lies that stole decades. Wren appeared in the doorway, hesitant. Is this Grandpa Great's secret room? Calla wiped her eyes and nodded. Why did he keep it locked? Because some doors are too heavy to open alone, honey. Because sometimes the things that hurt us most are the things we can't let go. Wren didn't fully understand, but she climbed into Calla's lap anyway, offering wordless comfort the way children do. Outside, a vehicle approached. Engine diesel loud. Calla stood, moving to the barn's main entrance. A truck pulled into the driveway. Old Ford, primer-spotted Montana plates. A man climbed out, 60s, maybe weathered like driftwood, moving with the careful economy of someone whose body had logged hard years. He stopped when he saw Calla, seemed to recognize something in her face. You're Garrett's granddaughter. You look like him. Same eyes. Calla acknowledged it. The man extended a hand. Ezra Donnelly. I own the ranch east of here. Garrett and I were neighbors 40-some years. I heard he passed. Came to pay respects. They shook. Ezra's grip was calloused strong. He glanced past her to the barn's interior, to the helicopter visible through the open doors. His expression shifted, something like grief crossing his features. He never finished her. Worked on that bird off and on for 50 years, near as I can tell. Every time I thought he'd given up, I'd hear sounds from the barn at 3 in the morning. Hammering, welding, like something drove him that wouldn't let him rest. Calla asked if Ezra knew about Sloane. The old man was quiet for a long moment. Finally he nodded. Garrett told me once, years ago. We'd been drinking, which he rarely did. He said he built that helicopter to fly to a woman who didn't want him. Said he kept working on it because stopping would mean admitting she was right to leave. I didn't push. Figured a man's grief is his own business. Did you ever meet her? No. She left Ashwood Hollow before I moved here. Married some fella from Missoula, I heard. Well off, respectable. Everything Garrett wasn't least in her father's eyes. Calla thought about the letters, about the lies that shaped both their lives. Ezra shifted, uncomfortable with emotion. Anyway, I came to offer help. You're planning to stay, I expect. That's what the will requires. How did you know about the will? Small town. Lawyer's secretary is married to the grocer. Word spreads. He smiled without humor. Vivian's already making noise about development projects and eminent domain. Figured you might need someone on your side. Calla looked at this stranger offering alliance, trying to gauge sincerity. Why would you help me? Because Garrett was a good man who got dealt a bad hand. And because watching Preston Hale turn this ridge into condominiums would make me sick. But mostly because that helicopter deserves better than rotting in this barn for another 70 years. If you're going to finish what your grandfather started, you'll need someone who knows which end of a wrench is which. Can you teach me to fly helicopters? Ezra laughed, surprised. I can teach you to fix damn near anything. Flying's another matter. But let's focus on making her airworthy first. One impossible thing at a time. That night, Calla sat in the barn with a battery-powered lamp and Garrett's journal. Wren slept in the truck's back seat, wrapped in blankets, safe enough for now. Tomorrow they'd figure out living arrangements. Tonight, Calla needed to understand the scope of what she'd inherited. The blueprints on the workshop wall detailed modifications far beyond her expertise. Dual rotor configuration, counter-rotating to eliminate torque. Engine placement optimized for stability. Avionics from the 1950s that would need complete replacement. The design was brilliant, she could see that even with her limited knowledge. Innovative enough that it might have actually impressed Sloane's father, might have changed everything if only Garrett had finished it before she married someone else. She found more letters in the box, later ones from 1954 after Sloane's marriage. The desperation in them hurt to read. Garrett, I made a terrible mistake. Harold is kind, but I don't love him. I love you. I always will. Please, if you ever loved me, write back. Tell me you haven't given up. Tell me there's still a way. I'm begging you. But Garrett had never received them. Had spent 70 years believing Sloane chose wealth over him, never knowing she'd fought to come back. Calla's phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown Montana number. She opened it. This is Vivian. Preston filed preliminary eminent domain paperwork this morning. Public good assessment, economic development priority. Your 90 days just got a lot more complicated. Sell now, avoid the lawyers. This is a kindness. Calla deleted the message. She pulled up a browser despite the weak cell signal and searched Sloane, Ashford, Montana. Nothing useful. Sloane Kincaid returned too many results. She tried Sloane Ashford Kincaid. An obituary appeared. Harold Kincaid, beloved husband, father, grandfather. Died 2005. Survived by wife, Sloane Ashford Kincaid, daughter Margot Ashford Kincaid. Still alive. The woman in Garrett's photographs in his journal in his heart still alive somewhere. Calla searched further and found a listing. Sloane Ashford Kincaid, Missoula, Montana. Age 70. 4 hours away. Reachable. Real. Calla found paper and a pen among Garrett's supplies. She wrote carefully, conscious that this letter might be the first true communication between these two lives in 70 years. Dear Mrs. Kincaid, you don't know me, but my grandfather, Garrett Whitmore, knew you. I'm writing because he passed away recently and left me his barn, his land, and a helicopter he spent most of his life building. A helicopter I think he built for you. I found your letters, the ones marked refused. I don't think he ever saw them. I think someone kept them from him. I think maybe you and he lost decades to a lie. I don't know if this matters to you now after so long, but I thought you should know he loved you until the day he died. I can prove it if you'd like to see. There's a photograph of you in his workshop. He kept it framed. He kept everything. My daughter looks like you, according to a neighbor who knew you both. Maybe that's why he left all this to me. Maybe he hoped I'd finish what he couldn't. I don't know if I can, but I'm going to try. If you want to know more, or if you just want to tell me I'm crazy for writing, my number is below. Respectfully, Calla Frost. She found an envelope, addressed it to the Missoula listing, drove 2 miles to where cell service returned, and looked up the nearest post office. In the morning, she'd mail it. Tonight, she returned to the barn. Wren still slept. Calla climbed into the helicopter's cockpit, sitting where Garrett must have sat thousands of times. The controls felt foreign. The instrument panel, even dormant, spoke of complexity she barely grasped. But underneath the intimidation, she felt something else. Connection. Purpose. The sense that maybe inheritance wasn't just about property. Maybe it was about finishing stories others started, about honoring the love people carried when life denied them the chance to live it fully. She thought about Garrett's final message. Build her. Fly her. Finish what I started. A request. A challenge. A hope that someone would care enough to complete what he couldn't. Calla had been taught her whole life that love was something you survived, that promises got broken, that dreams deferred eventually died. Trevor had reinforced those lessons with his fists, with his contempt, with the way he walked away from her and Wren without looking back. But sitting in a dead man's helicopter, holding letters that proved love could endure 70 years of separation, she wondered if maybe she'd learned the wrong lessons. If maybe the point wasn't surviving love, but believing in it fiercely enough to act, to build, to fly toward someone even if you never arrived. Because the building mattered, the attempt mattered, the refusal to let fear or failure or other people's cruelty make you stop. Direction isn't always forward, she thought, remembering something Garrett had once told her about engine timing. Sometimes you have to go back to compression before you can find power. Outside wind moved through the pines. Inside the helicopter waited patient as a prayer. And somewhere in Missoula, a woman who'd lost the same decades Garrett had might open a letter and remember what it felt like to be loved by a man who built impossible things in her name. Calla closed her eyes and made a promise to the darkness, to Garrett, to herself. 90 days. She'd give it 90 days. She'd learn what the helicopter needed, would find a way to make it whole, would fly it to the coordinates Garrett had written, to whatever place he'd marked as significant, would finish the promise he couldn't keep. Not because she knew how, not because it made sense, but because some inheritances demanded more than acceptance. They demanded completion. And Calla Frost, broke and desperate, and standing in the wreckage of her own failed promises, was done with leaving things unfinished. The helicopter's frame creaked in the wind, metal and time waiting. Calla placed her hand on the control stick and whispered the words that would carry her through everything that came next. Let's teach each other to fly. The phone rang at dawn, 6 days after Calla mailed the letter. She'd spent the intervening time making the barn habitable, stringing extension cords from a generator Ezra loaned her, setting up a camping stove and sleeping bags in what had been Garrett's office. Wren adapted with the resilience of children who've already learned that home is wherever their parent is, not a fixed location. The voice on the other end trembled with age and something deeper. This is Sloane Kincaid. You wrote to me about Garrett. Calla's chest constricted. She stepped outside so Wren wouldn't wake morning frost crunching beneath her boots. I wasn't sure you'd call. I wasn't sure I would either. A pause, breath gathering courage. But I dreamed about him last night for the first time in 40 years. And when I woke up, your letter was on my nightstand where I'd left it, and I thought maybe some things don't stay buried just because we want them to. Calla explained what she'd found. The helicopter, the workshop the letters marked, refused. She described the photographs, the journal entries, the coordinates written in Garrett's hand. Sloane's silence stretched so long Calla thought the connection had dropped. Then quietly, he never got my letters. All this time I thought he rejected me, chose his pride over us. Someone intercepted them, stamped them, returned. Let you both believe lies. My father. It had to be. He controlled everything then. The money, the house, who I saw. When I tried to defy him about Garrett, he threatened to have him arrested on false charges. Said mechanics were all thieves, that he'd make sure Garrett never worked in Montana again. I was 23 and terrified. I thought if I married Harold, my father would calm down and later maybe Garrett and I could find a way. But later never came. Calla watched the sun rise through the pines' light, turning everything gold and merciless. Do you want to see the helicopter? Another long pause. Then yes. God help me, yes. I need to see what he built, what we lost. They arranged a meeting for the following afternoon. Sloan would drive from Missoula 3.5 hours through mountains that would be treacherous if snow fell. Calla spent the day cleaning the barn more thoroughly, moving aside clutter-making space. Ezra arrived mid-morning with a teenage boy in tow. This is Dashiell Porter, goes by Dash. Ranch kid smart with his hands, wants to learn aviation mechanics. Thought he could help. The boy looked embarrassed by the introduction, all angles and nervous energy. 17, maybe, hair perpetually in his eyes. I don't need paying, just want to learn something useful before I'm stuck ranching my whole life. Calla assessed him, saw herself at that age desperate to escape limitations other people assumed were permanent. You know anything about helicopters? Nothing. But I learn fast and I don't quit. She handed him a socket wrench and pointed at the helicopter's engine mount. Start with that. Every bolt cataloged by size and condition. We need to know what's salvageable. Dash grinned and got to work. Ezra pulled Calla aside while the boy focused on disassembly. Vivian's husband filed paperwork with the county, safety inspection scheduled for next week. They're claiming the barn is structurally unsound, dangerous to occupy. If the inspector rules against you, they can condemn the property, force a sale. How long do I have to fix 70 years of neglect? Not long enough, but we'll do what we can. They worked through the afternoon, Ezra teaching Calla which supports needed reinforcement, which roof sections required patching. The labor was brutal, physical, in a way that left no room for thinking about Trevor or divorce or the precariousness of everything. Just nails and wood and the immediate problem of keeping walls vertical. Sloan arrived as the light began to fade. She drove a silver sedan, parked carefully, sat for several minutes before emerging. When she finally stepped out, Calla saw the photograph come to life. 70 years had softened the angles, added grace to what had been youthful beauty. She moved slowly, leaning on a cane, but her eyes remained sharp. Wren ran to greet her before Calla could intervene, childish enthusiasm overriding adult caution. Are you the lady Grandpa? Great loved? Sloan's hand went to her mouth. She knelt with difficulty, meeting Wren at eye level. I suppose I am, though I didn't know he still loved me until your mother's letter. He kept your picture in a frame, in the secret room. Mama showed me. Did he? Sloan's eyes filmed with tears. That's very kind of him. She straightened, leaning heavily on the cane, and looked past Calla to the barn. Her expression shifted through recognition, grief, wonder. She walked inside as if entering a cathedral. The helicopter sat in the center of the space, partially disassembled. Now components spread across workbenches in organized chaos. Sloan approached slowly, reaching out to touch the fuselage with fingers that shook. Windbound. He told me the name once. Said I made him feel like he could fly, but also like he needed ground beneath him. Like love was both freedom and anchor. Calla watched Sloan circle the aircraft, her weathered hands trailing over metal Garrett had shaped decades ago. I was engaged to him, you know. Summer of 1953. We kept it secret because my father would have destroyed him. We planned to elope after Garrett finished this, after he could prove himself capable of supporting a family. But my father found my diary, read everything. He locked me in my room for 3 days. When he finally let me out, he showed me a newspaper article about a mechanic arrested for theft. Garrett's name. Except it wasn't true. My father had paid someone to file false charges, then paid the right people to make them disappear. But the message was clear. Cross him, and Garrett would suffer. So you married Harold Kincaid. I married safety. I married the life my father approved. And I spent 51 years wondering if I was a coward or just realistic. Dash had stopped working, listening despite himself. Ezra stood near the door, witness to a confession 70 years deferred. Sloan turned to Calla, tears tracking down her face. I wrote Garrett 47 letters begging him to take me away, offering to risk everything if he'd just say the word. When they all came back marked refused, I thought he'd chosen his pride over me. Thought he couldn't forgive me for doubting him, for letting my father's threats work. I didn't know someone had stolen those letters. Didn't know Garrett spent his life thinking I abandoned him. The barn was silent except for wind moving through gaps in the walls. Would you like to see the workshop? The letters are there. Everything he kept. Sloane nodded, unable to speak. Calla led her to the small room, opened the door. Sloane stood at the threshold, staring at the photographs on the walls, at her younger self, frozen in moments of joy. She moved to the desk, picked up the carved box containing the letters. Her hands trembled as she opened it, seeing the return to sender stamps, recognizing her own handwriting. She sank into the chair and read letter after letter, watching her younger self beg for a response that never came. When she finally finished, her face was ravaged. We lost everything to a lie. 70 years. I had a daughter with Harold, a good life by most measures. But this. She gestured at the room, at the evidence of Garrett's sustained grief. This is what love looks like when it has nowhere to go. And I carried the same thing, just hid it better. Calla pulled over a crate to sit on, giving Sloane space but staying close. Your daughter, Margot. Does she know about Garrett? Number Harold was a good father. I never saw the point in telling her about a man I thought didn't want me. But now, knowing the truth, I'm not sure what to do. The honest thing. The thing that honors what you and Garrett had. Sloane looked at the photograph of herself on the wall. Honesty at 70 feels different than at 23. Like the stakes are both lower and unbearable. They sat together in the failing light, two women separated by decades, connected by a man whose love had outlived him. Eventually, Sloane asked about the coordinates. Calla showed her Garrett's note. Sloane's breath caught. That's Ashwood Lake Overlook, where he proposed. We used to hike there, away from town, away from my father's eyes. There's an old pine tree with our initials carved in it. Or there was 40 years ago. He wanted to fly there. Wanted to finish this helicopter and land at the place where you said yes. Sloane closed her eyes. I did say yes. I meant it. I just didn't believe we could survive my father's opposition. And I was right, wasn't I? We didn't survive. But you could finish it now. Help me restore Windbound. Fly to the Overlook, complete what Garrett started. I'm 70 years old and dying, Calla. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. They gave me 6 months, maybe a year. That's part of why I called. I don't have time left to waste on pretending I don't care about unfinished business. The revelation hit like physical force. Calla hadn't expected that, hadn't factored terminal illness into the equation. Then we work fast. We finish this before you run out of time. Sloane laughed, bitter and surprised. You don't know what you're proposing. That helicopter is 50 years from airworthy. The engineering alone would take teams of experts. Ezra stepped into the doorway. I know a few experts who owe Garrett favors, and this town has more skilled hands than it likes to admit. We can do this. For what? Sloane's voice sharp with pain. For sentiment. For closure. Those things don't fix cancer. No. Calla cut in, her voice harder than intended. But maybe they fix regret. You said you've carried this love for 70 years with nowhere to put it. Windbound is where you put it. You finish what got stolen from you. And when you fly to that overlook, you get to tell Garrett's ghost that you never stopped loving him either. That the lie didn't win. Sloane stared at her, something shifting in her expression. My daughter will think I've lost my mind. Probably. But you're dying anyway. Might as well die doing something impossible. The old woman smiled, real warmth breaking through grief. You're very like him, you know. Garrett had that same stubborn certainty that broken things could be fixed if you just refused to give up. Is that a yes? Sloane set down the letters, stood with effort. It's a yes. I'll fund whatever parts you need. I'll be here every day I'm physically able. And when we fly that damn helicopter, I'm sitting in the cockpit Garrett built for me. They shook hands, sealing a promise across generations. The county inspector arrived on Thursday, accompanied by Vivian and Preston. The inspector was young, efficient, armed with a clipboard and building codes. He walked the barn's perimeter, testing supports, measuring load-bearing beams, photographing every visible flaw. Vivian stayed close to Calla, her voice poisonous with false concern. "This really is dangerous. Someone could get hurt. Preston is offering $5,000 above market value now. Take the money before the county condemns this place and you get nothing." Calla ignored her, focusing instead on the inspector's report. He delivered the verdict without emotion. Multiple structural deficiencies, roof compromised in 6 locations, foundation settling unevenly, electrical system non-existent or hazardous where present. The barn would require a minimum of $15,000 in repairs completed within 30 days to meet basic safety standards for occupancy. 30 days to find money Calla didn't have. Preston smiled, sensing victory. That evening, Sloan returned with a check. $15,000 made out to Calla. "Consider it an investment. In history and love, in refusing to let small men with small dreams win." Calla tried to protest. "This is too much. It's not nearly enough. Harold left me comfortable. I'd rather spend his money on something that matters than leave it to relatives who'll just fight over it." They hired a local contractor, a man named Webb, who'd worked with Garrett decades ago. He brought a crew and materials, began systematically addressing the inspector's concerns. Roof-patched supports reinforced, a proper electrical panel installed. The barn transformed from derelict to functional in 3 weeks of focused labor. During this time, Dash proved invaluable. He absorbed mechanical knowledge like drought earth. Taking rain worked hours beyond what Calla asked, showed initiative that reminded her of herself before Trevor convinced her that ambition in a woman was threatening. Ezra taught him diagnostic techniques, how to read wear patterns in metal, how to understand what an engine needed by listening to the silence where sound should be. The boy thrived under attention and purpose. Midway through the 2nd week, a car arrived that didn't belong. Newer sedan, Seattle plates. A woman emerged, 40-ish, dressed in architect casual, her expression mixing concern and irritation. She approached Calla directly. "I'm looking for Sloan Kincaid. I was told she's been spending time here." "That's my mother. I'm Margot Ashford Kincaid, and I need to know what kind of scam you're running." Calla set down the wrench she'd been using. "No scam. Your mother knew my grandfather. She's helping restore something he built. My mother has terminal cancer, stage 3. She should be resting, seeing specialists, not driving 3 hours through mountains to work on some dead man's project. She's an adult. She made her choice. Based on what sentiment manipulation? You send her a letter dredging up ancient history and suddenly she's pouring money into your barn renovation. That's elder abuse." Calla's temper flared. "Your mother is 70, not senile. She knows exactly what she's doing and why." "Which is what exactly?" Margot's voice cut sharp as wire. "Finishing a love story," your father interrupted. "Honoring a promise stolen by lies. Doing something that matters before time runs out." Margot laughed without humor. "My father gave her 51 good years. A daughter, grandchildren, stability. What gives you the right to dishonor his memory?" "I'm not dishonoring anything. I'm telling the truth. Your mother loved Garrett Whitmore first. She was engaged to him. Your grandfather intercepted her letters, sabotaged their relationship, forced her into marrying Harold. Those are facts, not sentiment. According to who? A dead mechanic's journals. According to 47 letters your mother wrote begging Garrett to take her away. Letters she thought he refused. Letters that were actually stolen and marked returned to sender by your grandfather. You want proof. It's all in the workshop." Margot's certainty wavered. She glanced toward the barn, calculating. At that moment, Sloan's sedan pulled into the driveway. The old woman emerged, saw her daughter, and her expression hardened. "Margot, what are you doing here?" "What am I doing, Mom? You've been lying to me for 2 weeks. Telling me you're seeing specialists when you're actually up here playing mechanic with strangers." "I was worried sick. I'm dying, Margot. Specialists can't fix that. But this..." She gestured at the barn at Windbound, visible through the open doors. "This I can finish. This is insane. You barely knew this man. I was engaged to him. I loved him for 70 years. That he's dead doesn't make it less true. You were married to my father. I was. And I tried to love him the way I loved Garrett. But trying isn't the same as succeeding. You deserved honesty about that. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to give it. Margot looked stricken. Dad deserved better than being someone's second choice. He deserved better than being trapped in a marriage his father-in-law arranged, but he was kind and patient and good. I'm grateful for the life we had. I'm grateful for you. But gratitude isn't the same as the kind of love that builds helicopters. The words hung there brutal and necessary. Margot's voice cracked. I don't understand why you're doing this now. Because I don't have later. Because Garrett died thinking I chose money over him and I can't let that stand as his final truth. Because if we finish Windbound and fly her to where he proposed, I get to tell his memory that I never stopped saying yes. That the lie didn't win, even if it cost us everything. Tears tracked down Margot's face. She looked at her mother at the helicopter at Calla. Finally defeated. Show me the letters. They spent 2 hours in the workshop, Margot reading her mother's younger self, begging for rescue that never came. She examined the photographs, the journal, the evidence of a love her mother had carried in silence through an entire marriage. When she emerged, her face was changed. She found Calla working on the helicopter's transmission housing. I'm an architect. I specialize in restoration projects. If you're serious about making this airworthy, you need engineering assessments, structural integrity, verification, someone who can navigate building codes and FAA regulations. We can't afford an architect. I'm not asking for money. I'm asking to help my mother finish something that matters to her, and to understand the man who apparently shaped her life more than my father did. Calla accepted with a nod. They shook hands, alliance forged from necessity and shared purpose. That night Dash discovered something. He'd been working on removing corroded panels from the helicopter's undercarriage when his foot punched through a weak board. Beneath the floor, something metallic reflected his flashlight beam. He called Calla over. Together they pried up floorboards, revealing a metal box encased in poured concrete. Old, deliberately hidden. They spent an hour with crowbars and hammers before the concrete cracked enough to extract the box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, another set of blueprints. More sophisticated than the originals labeled Windbound 2. Photographs of a different aircraft, sleeker, smaller, demonstrably functional. Flight logs in Garrett's handwriting dated 1955 through 1958 documenting hundreds of test flights. And at the bottom a telegram. Department of the Air Force dated March 1959. Project Windbound 2 classified under National Security Act. Cease all operations immediately. All documentation to be surrendered. Failure to comply will result in prosecution. Ezra examined the documents with growing recognition. I'll be damned. Garrett worked classified projects after Sloan married. He never told me specifics, just said the government took interest in some designs he'd developed. Margot studied the blueprints with professional focus. These innovations, this dual rotor configuration, the torque compensation, this is decades ahead of its time for the 1950s. Helicopters didn't achieve this level of stability until the 70s. So Garrett invented it first and the military classified everything, which means his genius got buried. No patents, no credit, no recognition, just silence, and a life spent watching other people get credit for his ideas. Calla felt rage building. He lost Sloan, lost his life's work, lost everything. And nobody knew because the government erased him. We can change that. Margot's voice carried the weight of professional certainty. These documents prove historical significance. If we restore Windbound, if we can demonstrate it's based on legitimate innovations, this property can qualify for historical landmark status, which would block any eminent domain claims permanently. Preston would lose his development project. Completely. But we'd need to make Windbound airworthy and document everything. Full engineering analysis, historical context, proof of Garrett's contributions to aviation. How long would that take, with proper resources and focus? 8 weeks, maybe 10. But we'd need a certified pilot willing to fly an experimental aircraft. Calla met her gaze. I'll fly it. You're not a pilot. I will be by the time we finish. The work intensified. Margot brought in engineering contacts, people who owed her favors or simply wanted to be part of something impossible. They assessed every component created. Detailed reports began the documentation that would prove Windbound's significance. Sloane came daily, fading visibly but refusing to slow down. She worked alongside Calla, her hands remembering skills from youth. Together they cleaned decades of grime from the cockpit, replaced corroded wiring, rebuilt the control linkages. One evening, after everyone else had left, Sloane sat in the pilot's seat and closed her eyes. "I need to tell you the whole truth about why I didn't fight harder. You don't owe me explanations. I owe Garrett. And since he's not here, you'll have to do." Sloane's voice carried weight that came from bearing secrets too long. "When I married Harold, I was 3 months pregnant." Calla went still. "I didn't know at the wedding. Found out 2 weeks after. The timing was wrong for it to be Harold's. Margot is Garrett's daughter. I've known since before she was born, and I never told anyone. Not Harold, not Garrett, not her." The revelation detonated everything Calla thought she understood. "Does Harold know?" "He figured it out eventually. The genetics weren't subtle. Margot looks nothing like him, everything like photos of Garrett's mother. But Harold loved her anyway, raised her as his own, never said a word about it. That's the kind of man he was. And Garrett died never knowing he had a daughter. I tried to tell him once. 1975, I saw him in Helena. We locked eyes across the street. I almost crossed to him, almost said everything. But I'd made a bargain with God when Margot was born premature. She nearly died, spent weeks in an incubator. I prayed every prayer I knew, promised that if she lived, I'd never contact Garrett again, never disrupt the life I'd chosen. Margot survived, and I kept my word, even when it meant Garrett died alone. Even then. You asked why I'm doing this now. It's because the bargain's over. I'm dying. Margot's grown, and Garrett deserves to know someone finished what he started. Someone who carries his blood, flew his helicopter to the place where we promised each other forever. You're going to tell Margot. After we fly. After she sees what her father built. Then she can decide what she wants to do with the truth." Calla sat with that understanding, the weight Sloane had carried. Does it change anything? Knowing Margot is his everything. Nothing. She's still my daughter. Harold was still her father in every way that mattered. But yes, it changes things. Because when we fly Windbound, it won't just be me honoring a lost love. It'll be his daughter taking him home. 2 days later, Preston's lawyers filed an injunction attempting to halt work on the barn. They claimed ongoing construction violated zoning regulations, that the helicopter constituted an unlicensed industrial project, that noise and activity disrupted the peace of surrounding properties. Vivienne delivered the papers personally, her expression combining triumph and something that might have been regret. "This is your last chance, Calla. Preston is offering $200,000 now. Walk away while you can. Why do you hate me this much? We're family." Vivienne's composure cracked. "Because Garrett loved you. Visited you in Denver, called you every month, saved money for your education. Where was that for me? I spent 20 years checking on him, bringing him groceries, making sure he didn't die alone in this barn. And when he wrote his will, he gave everything to you. A granddaughter who hadn't visited in decades. That's why. He left you $50,000 in bonds. Did you even cash them?" Vivienne blinked, genuinely surprised. "What? The lawyer didn't tell you Garrett set up a separate bequest. Bonds and stocks matured over 30 years. You're entitled to them regardless of what happens to this property." The fight drained from her face. "He did that. For me, he loved his whole family, Vivienne. But I spent summers here as a kid. He taught me engines, taught me to believe I could fix things other people said were broken. That's why he left me Windbound. Not because he loved you less, but because he knew I'd understand what finishing it meant." Vivienne's hands shook as she held the injunction papers. "Preston doesn't need this deal. His company is solvent either way. He's doing this because he can. Because watching people fight over scraps makes him feel powerful. Then stop helping him. It's not that simple. We're married. community property state. If I withdraw support, he'll divorce me and I'll lose everything. Or you'll lose everything worth keeping and gain back yourself. Your choice. Vivian left without another word. The injunction remained, but something in her had shifted. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. Margot worked 18-hour days preparing documentation. Ezra coordinated with the contractor to ensure every repair met code. Dash and Calla focused on making Windbound mechanically sound component by component. Sloane grew weaker. Some days she couldn't make the drive. On those days, she called Calla and talked her through procedures, sharing knowledge from when she and Garrett had worked together decades ago. When she could visit, she sat in the barn and watched progress with fierce attention, as if witnessing a resurrection required every bit of strength she had left. 1 week before the hearing, Vivian returned. Without Preston, without lawyers, just herself carrying a file folder. "I'm withdrawing from the eminent domain claim, filing for divorce, and I brought something you need." She handed over the folder. Inside, photographs of Preston meeting with county officials, documents showing payoffs and favors exchanged. Proof that the entire development scheme was built on corruption. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because I'm tired of being the villain in someone else's story. And because Garrett deserved better than what happened to him. If finishing that helicopter gives him peace, then I want to be part of that, not the obstacle." The hearing became a formality. With Vivian's evidence and Margot's documentation, Preston's claims collapsed. The judge ruled the property historically significant, denied eminent domain, and launched an investigation into Preston's business practices. Calla stood outside the courthouse afterward, Wren's hand in hers, and felt the impossible weight of winning. Ezra clapped her shoulder. "One battle done. Now comes the hard part. Making it fly, making it matter. Metal and engineering are easy compared to what you're actually building here, which is proof that some promises survive everything. Even death, even decades, even the lies that tried to kill them. That's what Garrett was really building. Not a helicopter. A testimony that love this big doesn't fit inside the life you're given. It demands more." They returned to the barn where Windbound waited, nearly whole now, nearly ready. And Calla understood that finishing this meant more than mechanical success. It meant giving Sloane the ending she'd been denied, giving Margot a father she never knew she had, giving Garrett's ghost the vindication that his love hadn't been wasted. It meant teaching dead things to fly. The flight instructor arrived on a Tuesday morning when Frost still clung to the grass. Quinn Mercer, ex-Army aviation, now freelancing out of Missoula. Ezra had found him through connections that ran deeper than friendship favors owed across decades of Montana living. Quinn walked around Windbound with professional skepticism, running his hands over the rebuilt rotor assembly, checking control linkages, examining the engine mounts Calla had spent 3 weeks perfecting. His verdict came without preamble, airworthy barely. Experimental enough that no sane pilot would fly it without extensive ground testing first. "But you'll teach me anyway." Quinn looked at her, assessing something beyond mechanical competence. "Why do you need to fly it yourself?" "Plenty of certified pilots would take this up for the right price. Because the woman who this was built for is dying. Because she needs to sit in the seat her fiancé made for her and fly to the place where they promised each other a future that got stolen. And because hiring a stranger means it becomes a transaction instead of what it actually is. Which is what? The kind of promise that doesn't fit inside normal life. The kind that demands you become someone different than who you were." Quinn set down his clipboard. "Ground school starts tomorrow. 6 weeks if you're fast, 8 if you're human. You'll need to pass FAA written exams, log minimum flight hours in a certified trainer, then solo test. After that, we see if this bird actually flies or if she tears herself apart the moment you lift collective." Calla had 6 weeks before Sloane's oncologist predicted complete system failure. 6 weeks to transform from mechanic to pilot to master skills that took most people years. The math didn't work. She committed anyway. The training consumed her. Mornings began at 5 with ground school, Quinn drilling her on aerodynamics, weather systems, emergency procedures. She learned why helicopters flew, why they crashed, why every input she made would fight against physics until she learned to work with forces instead of against them. Afternoons she spent in a Robinson R-22, the trainer Quinn borrowed from a flight school that owed him favors. The machine felt alien compared to Windbound's vintage controls. Responsive where Garrett's design was deliberate, forgiving where the older aircraft would punish mistakes. Quinn taught her to hover, that maddening discipline of holding position while wind and gravity conspired to move you. The first dozen attempts ended in wild oscillations, the helicopter swinging like a pendulum as Calla overcorrected every drift. "You're fighting it. Stop fighting. Feel where it wants to go and suggest otherwise. Helicopters don't respond to force. They respond to conversation." She learned to translate intention into microsecond adjustments, cyclic and collective working in harmony, her hands had to discover through repetition. Hours of practice until hovering became meditation, until she could hold position in 15-knot winds without conscious thought. Forward flight came easier. Transitional lift, the magic moment when momentum transforms rotors from mere vertical thrust into proper wings. She flew patterns over Ashwood Hollow, learning to read the landscape from above, to judge distance and altitude without instruments. Evenings she returned to the barn where Dash and Ezra continued refining Windbound. The helicopter grew whole under their attention panels. Aligned systems integrated the dual rotor assembly balanced so precisely that hand spinning them generated no wobble. Margot worked parallel tracks, documenting everything for the historical registry application. She photographed components, interviewed Ezra about Garrett's methods, compiled evidence that would preserve this story beyond the people who lived it. Sloan came when she could, which became less often. Cancer accelerated its consumption. Some days she sat in a folding chair and watched, offering suggestions drawn from memories of helping Garrett decades ago. Other days she stayed in Missoula, too weak for the drive, calling instead to ask about progress. 4 weeks into training, Calla soloed. Quinn climbed out of the R-22 and told her to take it up, fly a pattern, bring it back whole. She lifted into Montana sky alone, feeling the helicopter respond to her inputs like it had been waiting for exactly this pilot. 20 minutes aloft, every moment conscious that death was one mistake away, every second aware that this was what Garrett had wanted Sloan to feel. Untethered, infinite, free. She landed smoothly, Quinn's nod the only approval she needed. 2 weeks later she passed the written exam with scores high enough that the FAA examiner asked if she'd flown before. The practical test came days after demonstrating emergency procedures and navigation. When Quinn handed her the temporary pilot certificate, his expression carried something like respect. "You're qualified to fly certified aircraft in controlled conditions. What you're planning with Windbound is neither of those things." "I know. And you're doing it anyway. Sloan's running out of time. We all are, really. But hers has a number attached. So yes, I'm doing it anyway. Then let's make sure that antique doesn't kill you. We've got 1 week to test fly her before Sloan's doctor says she won't survive the drive." They spent 7 days on final preparations. Ezra machined replacement parts for components too degraded to trust. Dash ran diagnostics on the electrical system, checking and rechecking connections. Margot completed the historical documentation, submitting it to the Montana Historical Society with supporting evidence so comprehensive that approval seemed inevitable. Vivian appeared on the 5th day, hesitant, carrying a box of photographs. She'd found them in her mother's attic, images of Garrett from the 1940s and 50s that nobody knew existed. Pictures of him in Army Air Corps uniform standing beside bombers. Working in the barn when it was new, before isolation calcified into identity. Young and whole and unmarked by loss. I thought Sloan should have these, for the flight. So Garrett's there with her, even if just in photographs. Calla accepted them, saw past Vivian's attempt at amends to the grief underneath. "You visited him for 20 years. That matters too. He never talked to me the way he must have talked to you. Never taught me anything. I was just the person who brought groceries and got thanked politely. Maybe he didn't know how to let you closer. Some people build walls so high they forget there were supposed to be doors." Vivian left the photographs and drove away her sedan, disappearing into pines like absolution. On the 6th day, Sloane arrived looking like mortality had already claimed most of her. Margot drove, had been driving exclusively now, fear etched in her face every time her mother struggled for breath. They'd had conversations Calla knew. Mother and daughter negotiating what truth meant and how much of it could be spoken before it became weapon instead of gift. Sloane insisted on seeing Windbound in her completed state. They'd painted her navy blue, the color Garrett had specified in blueprints, with silver trim that caught light like water. The dual rotors gleamed, balanced perfectly, ready to cut air the way they'd been designed to 70 years ago. Sloane walked around the aircraft slowly, her cane now a necessity rather than precaution. She touched the fuselage where Garrett's hands had shaped metal, ran fingers over controls he'd calibrated. When she reached the pilot's seat, she turned to Margot. "Help me up. I need to sit in at once before we fly." "Mom, you're too weak. I'm dying, not dead. There's a difference." Margot and Calla lifted her carefully into the cockpit. Sloane settled into the seat, hands finding the collective and cyclic like muscle memory from a life she'd never lived. She closed her eyes, and for a moment the years fell away. She looked young again, or maybe just complete. "He built this for me. Every rivet, every wire, every piece of this was him saying he loved me enough to create something impossible. And I spent 70 years thinking he'd given up. He never did." Calla kept her voice gentle. "He just didn't know how to finish without you." Sloane opened her eyes, looked at her daughter. "There's something I need to tell you, something I should have said 40 years ago." Margot's expression shifted, wary. "Mom, you don't have to." "Yes, I do, because when we fly tomorrow you need to understand what you're completing." Sloane drew breath that rattled. "Harold wasn't your biological father. Garrett was. I got pregnant before I married, didn't know until after. I never told anyone. Harold figured it out eventually, but loved you anyway. Raised you as his without question. But genetically, biologically, Garrett Whitmore was your father." The barn went silent. Dash found somewhere else to be. Ezra studied his boots. Calla stood witness to a truth detonating across generations. Margot's voice came out strangled. "You lied to me my entire life. I protected you. There was a difference when you were young. By the time you were old enough to handle it, telling felt like betraying Harold. He earned the title father. Genetics didn't. But I had a right to know. You did. You do. I'm telling you now because tomorrow when you fly your father's helicopter to the place where he proposed to me, you deserve to understand the full weight of what we're completing." Margot climbed into the barn's loft and didn't come down for 2 hours. When she finally descended, her face was ravaged but set. "I need to see everything. All the letters, all the journals, everything that proves who he was." They spent the night in the workshop, Margot reading her father's words, seeing through his eyes the love that built Windbound. She examined photographs of him young, traced the resemblance she'd apparently inherited without knowing its source. Near dawn, she found a picture of Garrett at 25 standing beside a B-17 and held it next to her driver's license photo. The similarity was undeniable. Harold was my dad, but Garrett was my father, and I never got to know him. Calla sat beside her among the scattered evidence of inheritance. "He died believing you were another man's daughter, believing Sloane chose security over him. Tomorrow you can correct that. When you fly Windbound to Ashwood Lake, you're telling him the truth finally reached someone who mattered. Will it change anything? He's still dead. Maybe death isn't the end of every conversation. Maybe some truths echo forward until someone hears them." The morning of the flight arrived clear and cold. October sky stretched infinite above Montana peaks. They'd chosen early departure to avoid afternoon winds to give Sloane maximum strength. Quinn arrived at dawn, running final pre-flight checks with the thoroughness of someone who knew experimental aircraft killed enthusiasts regularly. Windbound sat ready, fueled and balanced, waiting for the moment she'd been built toward. Ezra and Dash had spent the previous night going over every system one last time, their final gift to Garrett's memory. The plan was simple. Calla would pilot Quinn beside her to monitor and take control if needed. Sloane and Margot would follow in Quinn's conventional helicopter, staying close enough to witness but separate enough for safety. The flight to Ashwood Lake Overlook would take 30 minutes longer if Windbound proved temperamental. They helped Sloane into Quinn's aircraft first, strapping her into a seat she could barely fill anymore. Margot sat beside her mother, their hands clasped, 70 years of secrets compressed into this single journey. Calla climbed into Windbound's pilot seat, feeling Garrett's design surround her. The controls fit her hands as if he'd known she'd be the one to fly them. Quinn settled into the co-pilot position, running through the checklist one final time. Ready. Calla started the engine. The sound that emerged was pure and strong, decades of silence transforming into mechanical symphony. She felt vibration through the frame, felt Windbound wake after 70 years of stillness. The dual rotors began their rotation, accelerating smoothly, generating lift that pushed against the skids. She checked instruments, confirmed all readings green, took a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff. Her hands moved to the collective, ready to ask this machine for the impossible. Behind them, a small crowd had gathered. Wren stood with Vivian, both waving. Ezra watched with his arms crossed, expression unreadable. Dash held his phone up, recording this moment when metal and love and sheer stubborn refusal to quit combined into flight. Calla pulled collective smoothly. Windbound lifted 6 inches, 2 feet. The helicopter hung in hover, stable as prayer. She felt no shake, no oscillation, just clean, powerful response. Garrett's design worked. After 70 years, his genius proved itself in the simple fact of defying gravity. She pushed cyclic forward gently. Windbound transitioned to forward flight with grace that belied her age, dual rotors cutting air exactly as their builder had envisioned. They climbed through morning light, ascending above the barn that had housed this dream, above the pines that had witnessed its long dormancy. Quinn monitored systems, called out readings. Everything nominal. Oil pressure good. Rotor RPM optimal. She's flying like she was born for this. She was. Just took 70 years to find the right pilot. They headed north, following the valley toward Ashwood Lake. Behind them, Quinn's helicopter maintained formation. Sloane and Margot visible through the canopy. The landscape unfolded beneath them. Montana in autumn splendor, mountains wearing their first snow. Calla flew steady, feeling Windbound's personality reveal itself through small resistances and responses. The helicopter wanted gentle inputs, rewarded patience. Like flying something alive rather than mechanical. Like Garrett had poured enough love into the design that some essential quality beyond engineering emerged. 20 minutes into the flight, they crossed a ridge and Ashwood Lake appeared below. Sapphire water cradled by peaks perfect and remote. On the eastern shore, an overlook jutted from forest, the exact coordinates Garrett had written. Calla descended carefully, circling to assess the landing zone, a small clearing, tight but manageable. Ancient pine trees ringed it, one massive specimen standing sentinel. Even from above, she could see something carved in its trunk. She brought Windbound down with precision Quinn hadn't expected, settling onto ground that hadn't felt aircraft weight in geological time. The skids touched absorbed weight, held firm. She reduced throttle, let the rotors wind down, sat in sudden silence, broken only by wind through pines. They'd made it. Windbound had flown, had carried them to the place where Garrett proposed, where love had been offered and accepted before cruelty intervened. Quinn's helicopter landed 30 yards away. Margot helped Sloane out, the old woman leaning heavily but determined. They approached Windbound as Calla and Quinn climbed down. Sloane reached out to touch the fuselage, tears streaming. He did it. We did it. 70 years late, but we're here. The overlook offered views across the lake, across wilderness that looked unchanged from when Garrett and Sloane had hiked here as young lovers. Margot led her mother to the ancient pine, to the carving still visible in bark that had grown around it but never consumed it. G+S 1953, inside a heart, rough cut with a pocket knife. Sloane placed her palm over it. I said, yes, here, under this tree. He promised me we'd fly here together someday in the helicopter he was building. I believed him. Then my father took that future and twisted it into something else. But you're here now. Margot's voice carried weight of understanding she hadn't possessed yesterday. You and him through Windbound. And me, apparently. His daughter flying his design to his place. Sloane looked at Margot with something like peace. Harold gave you life in every way that mattered. But Garrett gave you the capacity to build impossible things. I see it in how you approach problems, how you refuse to accept limits. That's his legacy in you." Calla had brought Garrett's ashes the urn she'd been carrying since the funeral. She offered it to Sloane, who accepted with trembling hands. The four of them stood together, 3 generations connected by love that refused linear time. Sloane opened the urn and scattered Garrett's remains over the overlook into the wind above the lake where they'd promised each other forever. Her voice barely above a whisper. "I loved you. I never stopped. The lie didn't win, Garrett. We're here, and our daughter brought us home." Margot added her own words, speaking to a father she'd never known. "I wish I'd met you. I wish I'd known. But I'm glad your work continued through me, even if I didn't understand why I built things the way I do. Thank you for that." They stood until the wind had taken every trace of ash, until Garrett had become part of the wilderness he'd loved. Then Sloane asked to sit in Windbound one final time, to occupy the seat that had been meant for her. They helped her into the cockpit. She settled there, looking out through the canopy at the view Garrett had promised her 7 decades ago. This is what he saw when he designed this. Not just mechanics. This. Freedom, beauty, love transformed into flight. I understand now why he couldn't finish it without me. Some things aren't meant to be completed alone. She closed her eyes and rested there while Margot photographed everything, documenting the moment when a promise 70 years delayed finally reached its conclusion. The flight back carried different weight. Windbound flew steady, bearing them home through afternoon light that turned the mountains gold. When they landed at the barn, the small crowd had grown. Word had spread through Ashwood Hollow that the impossible had happened, that the dead mechanic's helicopter had flown. People applauded as Windbound's rotors wound down, not for spectacle, but for what the flight represented. Promises kept. Love honored. The stubborn refusal to let time or death or cruelty have the final word. Sloane lasted 6 more weeks, long enough to see Windbound granted historical landmark status, ensuring the barn and aircraft would be preserved. Long enough to watch Margot transform the property into a foundation, establishing programs that would teach young people the skills Garrett had mastered. Long enough to tell Calla that finishing Windbound had given her something she'd carried as absence for 70 years, the certainty that she'd been genuinely loved. The funeral was small, attended by people who understood that Sloane's real eulogy had been delivered on a mountain overlook when she scattered the ashes of a man she'd promised herself to, before life taught her that promises sometimes break through no fault of the people making them. Margot inherited her mother's estate and immediately directed most of it toward the foundation. She moved to Ashwood Hollow, bought property near the barn, began designing a proper facility to house Windbound and teach the next generation. 6 months after Sloane's death, the barn had transformed into something between museum and workshop. Windbound sat in a climate-controlled space, protected but visible, available for the young people who came to learn mechanical trades from Ezra and Calla. Dash had enrolled in aviation mechanics school, planning to return and teach. Wren thrived in a local school, her confidence built on watching her mother do impossible things. Calla discovered that teaching others gave purpose beyond survival, that watching teenagers understand how engines worked felt like extending Garrett's legacy through new hands. Vivian became an unexpected ally, using her divorce settlement to fund scholarships for students who couldn't afford tuition. She and Calla weren't friends exactly, but they'd reached understanding that family was more verb than noun, more action than blood. 1 year after the flight to Ashwood Lake, Calla was cleaning Windbound's interior when she noticed something odd. A panel near the tail, slightly misaligned, moving when it shouldn't. She pried carefully, and it released, revealing a small compartment she'd somehow missed in all previous inspections. Inside, a metal canister wrapped in oilcloth. She called Margot, and together they opened it. A film reel, Super 8, labeled in Garrett's handwriting, for whoever finishes Windbound. They borrowed a projector from the Historical Society and set it up in the workshop. Calla, Margot, Wren, Ezra, Dash. Vivian gathered as the film flickered to life. Garrett appeared on screen, younger than Calla had known him, but older than the photographs from his time with Sloane. Maybe 55, filming himself in the barn, His voice crackled through decades of magnetic degradation. I don't know who'll see this. Maybe no one. But I need to say it anyway. I built Windbound for Sloane. Worked on her for 50 years on and off whenever hope got stronger than grief. I never finished because finishing meant admitting she was really gone, that the future we promised each other would never arrive. He paused, looking directly at the camera. But here's what I learned: too late to matter. Failure isn't about stopping. It's about refusing to hand the work forward. I failed Sloane by keeping Windbound to myself, by treating it like a monument to loss instead of a foundation for someone else to build on. He gestured to the helicopter visible behind him. So whoever you are, whoever finished this, thank you. You gave meaning to years I thought were wasted. You proved that love this size doesn't die with the people who felt it. It just waits for someone brave enough to carry it forward. His expression softened. I hope you're reading this because Windbound flew, because someone cared enough to finish what an old man couldn't. That means my life amounted to more than regret. That means something I built mattered. The camera wobbled as he adjusted it. If you're young, don't wait like I did. Don't let fear or pride or other people's small thinking keep you from the big things. Love hard. Build impossible things. Refuse to accept that broken means finished. And if you're old like me, remember, it's never too late to hand your unfinished work to someone who'll complete it. Legacy isn't about doing everything yourself. It's about starting things worth finishing. The image flickered. Garrett smiled, raised his hand in something between wave and salute. Thank you for flying. Thank you for caring. Tell Sloane I never stopped loving her. The film ended in white light, the projector clicking on blank reel. Margot wept openly. Calla felt tears tracking down her own face. Even Vivian looked moved. Seeing the uncle she'd known revealed depths she'd never suspected. He knew. Margot's voice broke. Somehow he knew someone would finish this, would fly it, would bring his message to people who needed to hear it. Maybe that's what faith is. Calla wiped her eyes. Building something you won't see completed, trusting that the work matters enough that someone will care. 5 years later, the foundation had grown beyond anything Calla had envisioned. The barn was now the Whitmore Ashford Center for Aviation Heritage, serving students from across Montana. Windbound held place of honor in the main hall, surrounded by documentation of Garrett's innovations and their influence on modern helicopter design. Margot had married, adopted children, named her daughter Sloane. The little girl loved sitting in Windbound's cockpit, pretending to fly the way Wren once had. Wren herself, now 13, was enrolled in the center's junior pilot program. She'd soloed in a trainer the previous summer, showed aptitude that made Quinn claim she'd inherited something essential from Garrett through genetics that skipped generations. Calla had married Quinn 2 years prior, a quiet ceremony attended by the people who'd helped make Windbound fly. They lived in a house built near the barn, close enough that Calla could walk to work, far enough for privacy. The foundation had expanded to include scholarships for single mothers learning trades, a program Calla insisted on. Every student who passed through learned not just mechanical skills, but the story behind them. Learned that Windbound existed because someone loved hard enough to build impossible things, and because other people cared enough to finish what grief had interrupted. On the 5th anniversary of Sloane's death, they held a ceremony at Ashwood Lake Overlook. The foundation had purchased the land, protected it as historical site. The pine tree with its carved heart now stood marked with a plaque. Here Garrett Whitmore proposed to Sloane Ashford, 1953. Here their promise was finally kept, 2024. Calla stood with Quinn Wren Margot's family, Ezra-Vivian, and 36 students who'd graduated from the program. They released photographs into the lake, images of Garrett and Sloane Young, of Windbound flying, of the community that had formed around finishing what one man started. Flying back in Windbound afterward, Calla at the controls with Wren in the co-pilot seat, she understood something that had taken 5 years to crystallize. The helicopter hadn't been Garrett's real legacy. The people were. Everyone touched by the story of a love that refused to die, by proof that broken things deserved second chances, by the evidence that some promises survived everything, including the people who made them. Wren's voice broke her thoughts. Mom, when I'm old enough, can I fly Windbound? She's yours as much as mine, honey. You're Garrett's blood twice over. Through me, through Margot. You've got more right to her than anyone. What if I crash her? Then we rebuild. That's what we do. We take broken things and make them whole. They flew over Ashwood Hollow as the sun set, windbound shadow racing across treetops, and Calla thought about the workshop film, about Garrett's message that legacy meant handing unfinished work to people who'd complete it. She'd done that, built a place where others could learn, could build, could refuse to accept that broken meant finished, where Garrett's genius and Sloane's love could ripple forward through generations that would never meet them but would carry their story anyway. Below, the barn's lights came on, illuminating the center that bore their names. Students worked inside, learning skills that honored both the man who built impossible things and the woman he built them for. Learning that some inheritances demanded more than acceptance. They demanded completion, transformation, the courage to fly what dead men started. Direction isn't always forward. Sometimes the path to something new starts with finishing something old. Sometimes broken things don't need replacing, just someone who refuses to believe they're beyond repair. And sometimes love is the most impossible thing. We build the thing that outlasts us, the promise that echoes forward until someone hears it and decides to answer. Calla brought Windbound home as stars emerged, landing with a precision that would have made Garrett proud. The helicopter settled onto familiar ground rotors, winding down another flight completed in a machine built by someone who died believing his work didn't matter. But it had mattered, still did, would continue mattering as long as there were people willing to finish what others started, to honor promises time couldn't erase, to prove that broken things still deserve to rise.